Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Birth of British Airpower, Hugh Trenchard, World War I and the Royal Air Force, by Peter Dye. Narrated by Julian. Introduction. This work is about a remarkable friendship. A friendship forged in World War I that facilitated the creation of the world's first independent air service. An unlikely, barely credible partnership between a professional soldier and a scholar, poet, playwright, novelist. It is part history, part biography, part treatise, and part reflection. Hopefully, the listener will forgive the anecdotes that draw on personal experience to examine the nature of leadership and demonstrate why the challenges faced by senior commanders in World War I are of continuing relevance. It may appear, at least to external eyes, that military organizations are characterized by uniformity in thought, word and deed. The reality could not be more different. This is especially true of senior officers who, while exhibiting a veneer of similarity, retain a high degree of individuality. Careful recruitment, early indoctrination, intensive training, adherence to well-defined social norms, shared etiquette and common standards of dress, in and out of uniform, cannot eradicate personality or offer any guarantee about behavior. In fact, the need to employ such proactive and intrusive methods speaks to a constant battle between individuality and institutional norms. Senior officers, apparently immersed in the rituals and ethos that define military service, are just as likely to rebel as their juniors. Moreover, success in the form of rapid advancement imbues a self-confidence that resists conformity and encourages eccentricity. In describing the tensions and disagreements in the highest ranks of the British Air Services, the Royal Flying Corps, RFC, the Royal Naval Air Service, RNAS, and their successor organisation, the Royal Air Force, RAF, I am not arguing that aviation leaders are somehow different from other military leaders. An alternative narrative, focusing on the senior leadership of the British Army and Royal Navy, would likely paint a similar picture. Indeed, since the first direct entrants to the RAF did not achieve the very highest ranks until after 1945, the individuals central to this story were all recruited and trained by the other services, spending their formative years either soldiering or at sea. Nevertheless, the process of creating and sustaining an effective air weapon placed huge demands on senior officers and created an unprecedented dynamic that tested loyalties and fractured relationships. Given the obstacles to success, it is surprising that the attrition was not higher. Innovation is never easy in any sphere, and there is never a shortage of casualties. Air leadership should not be separated from other forms of military leadership. It may once have been fashionable to suggest otherwise, when military aviation was still in its infancy, but inspiring human beings in wartime requires the same qualities and skills in every fighting environment. Robert Wright, in his biography of Air Chief Marshal, ACM, Sir Hugh Dowding, Commander-in-Chief, CNC, of Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain, claimed, "These air marshals of the Royal Air Force had become a race apart from the usual run of service chiefs. While in some respects there was a blending of their Army and Navy backgrounds, the air had given them something more than just a service background. The outstanding quality in that was that it made them men who were nearly all pronounced individualists." Wright confuses the outcome with the man. Fighter Command's success in the summer of 1940 was owed to many factors, but inspirational leadership on the part of CNC, Fighter Command, was not one of them. Dowding's failure to resolve the destructive arguments and barely disguised antagonism between his immediate subordinates was no aberration. Rather, it was, as we will see, a pattern dating back nearly a quarter of a century to the earliest days of World War I. The characteristics of a good leader, self-awareness, integrity, vision, humility, moral courage, honesty, drive, consistency, and loyalty, are universal and timeless. They are not confined to air leaders, as distinct from other types of military leadership. Numerous books have been produced on the history of British military aviation, alongside biographies and autobiographies, but none have analysed the role of senior leadership in creating the third service. My focus on the RAF can be readily explained. It is the organisation I know best. Moreover, personal experience has afforded some understanding of the challenges of high command and the role of senior officers. A further factor was my involvement, at the turn of the century, in developing the RAF Senior Leadership Team, SLT, comprising all one-star officers and above, at that time some 35 individuals. This initiative emerged from separate papers on ethos and leadership that I took to the Air Force Board Standing Committee, AFBSC, in 2002 and 2003 respectively. The SLT concept, based on a Royal Australian Air Force initiative, was intended to provide a coherent and dynamic leadership group during a period of considerable organisational turbulence and fractured command arrangements. This experience revealed stark differences in temperament and personality between individual senior officers with an appetite for change that ranged from the reactionary to the radical. The variation in character, motivation and style, the last is more important than one might think, in a select group of high-achieving individuals sharing the same ethos who had trained and worked together for over 30 years, was unexpected. The RAF has never been hewn from a single block, but the picture that emerged showed much less homogeneity in thinking and behavioural preferences than might be expected. In the absence of any intermediate entry to the highest ranks, the only route to the top has been from the bottom. However, there is no evidence that this process has produced a succession of clones. While it may be popular to regard the likes of Major General J.F.C. Boney Fuller and Air Commodore Lionel Charlton as military outsiders, rare voices willing to challenge the establishment, it is possible that there was greater diversity among their contemporaries than is usually acknowledged. If so, the arguments and tensions found within the senior leadership of the RFC during its formative years may have been as much about personality as about professional differences. Personal experience with several major transformational programs has demonstrated that the senior leadership team must share and be seen to share the same vision. Organizational change exacerbates internal divisions and can rapidly lead to a breakdown in behavior unless leaders are visible and aligned. The potential for failure is magnified if people feel marginalized, neither looking to their neighbor for support nor offering support. Addressing this issue is more difficult in large organizations because the ties that bind individuals are that much looser. Inspirational leadership is fundamental in meeting these challenges, but the impact of senior commanders can be tenuous. Contact with their subordinates, even in a small headquarters, is rare and fleeting. Most staff will have a general awareness about a particular senior leader, but this will likely be based on reputation rather than direct experience. The shared stories that determine how a commander is perceived are often driven by rumour rather than by first-hand knowledge. In constructing such narratives, the influence of personal style looms large. I have observed a headquarters wary of telling their commander-in-chief anything of substance, in case they were criticised or subjected to detailed follow-up questions, only to see the position reverse in a matter of weeks when their successor demonstrated, in a casual and spontaneous manner, that he was happy to trust his staff. The result was greater openness and a willingness to raise difficult issues. Both commanders spent much the same amount of time in their offices as they did on external visits, but the contrast in how they handled themselves had far-reaching consequences for their reputations and the way business was conducted. The RAF is a meritocracy that rewards potential as well as performance. It has no hesitation in commissioning officers from the ranks, although none, so far, have emulated Sir William Robertson and become the professional head of their service. Because the RAF relies on technology and actively encourages the professional development of its non-commissioned ranks, there has always been a close relationship between officers and other ranks, closer than that routinely found in the other services. Rigid distinctions simply do not work in an environment that concedes respect based on knowledge as much as on status. This manifests itself in many ways. For example, there has always been a reactionary element in the RAF, particularly where drill is concerned. I recall one defence minister gravely proclaiming that the RAF couldn't march, as if this criticism, if correct, undermined any pretence to be a military organisation. We bristled at such prejudice, while likely agreeing with T.E. Lawrence, or Lawrence of Arabia, that our job is the conquest of the air, our element. That's more than large enough effort to comprehend all our intelligence. We grudge every routine duty, such as are invented for soldiers to keep them out of mischief and perform our parades deliberately ill, lest we lose our edges. The same minister, but probably not the Treasury, would likely have been appalled by Lawrence's conclusion that whenever the public see a detachment of airmen on a ceremonial, bullshit parade, they should realise that these, their very expensive servants, are being temporarily misemployed, as though cabinet ministers should hump coal in office hours. This is not to suggest that the RAF is some sort of egalitarian enterprise, free of the divisions that otherwise characterise society. In its early years, much of the RAF's social thinking was distinctly Edwardian. Even then, however, class and background were not a bar to advancement. A private income was not essential to pursue an Air Force career. Allegiance to a squadron was important, but it never represented the emotional and professional home that the regiment, or corps, offered army officers. Social cohesion between senior RAF officers can be looser than that found in the other services. The focus on individual skills and the implicit acknowledgement that, at least in the technical sphere, other ranks are the equal of officers, has created a less rigid and more malleable culture. Pilots have traditionally filled the bulk of the RAF's senior ranks, but since the end of the World War II, an increasing number of officers from other branches and genders have been promoted to air rank and served on the AFBSC. Advancement is highly competitive, and because retirement is fixed by age, albeit that service beyond 55 is possible, there are a finite number of individuals to fill key appointments. Rivalry within year groups can be fierce and sometimes less than friendly, precisely because the individuals have known each other for a considerable time. No senior officer has ever lacked ambition, but failure to gain advancement while others succeed can be the most corrosive of emotions. It blights friendships, creates enmity, and can lead to difficult relationships when an officer who believes they have been unfairly passed over is required to work for someone previously more junior. It is a rare individual who congratulates themselves on how far they have come, rather than fretting about how much more they could have achieved. It might be thought that all of this would detract from the smooth running of any organisation. The high degree of individuality among senior officers can certainly result in variable performance and unpredictable behaviour. I have known air marshals unwilling to make decisions other than to recruit deputies of the same disposition, endlessly calculating the relative advantage between action and inaction. Others have proved bold and decisive, demonstrating energy and clarity of vision. I have worked for, and alongside, air marshals acutely conscious of their own good fortune. Indeed, it has often seemed that those who had never striven for advancement, but achieved it all the same, somehow avoided the need to sacrifice humility on the altar of ambition. Self-awareness is not unusual among air marshals, although it should be said that self-absorption is a more common condition. While the Chief of the Air Staff, CAS, as the professional head of the RAF, has a large, but not exclusive hand in selecting their successor, this has never prevented changes in style, and often substance, between incumbents. A similar picture applies across all senior RAF ranks. The replacement of air officers every 2 to 3 years, whether in command or staff appointments, creates a dynamic that encourages fresh ideas and new approaches while limiting radical change. This continuous process of renewal and realignment depends as much on differences as on similarities within the leadership team. From an organisational perspective, differentiation can enhance decision-making in an uncertain and rapidly changing environment. The ability of a single individual to process information and weigh options based solely on their personal experience is increasingly difficult, if not impossible. Command decisions cannot be subordinated to a committee, but deferential acquiescence is equally dangerous. Without diversity of experience, character and personality within their senior leadership team, commanders are denied access to alternative perspectives. A further aspect that should be borne in mind is that the influence of senior officers does not end with retirement. Not every CAS is elevated to the House of Lords or serves for as long as Marshal of the RAF, MRAF, Sir Hugh Trenchard, but he was not unique in his willingness to provide advice to his successors. The ex-chiefs are not so much a power behind the throne as an informal standards committee, protective of their service and its reputation. This role has likely diminished with the recent trend for many of them to enter the world of defence procurement, lobbying or politics. Whether or not their subsequent contributions are always welcome, it can sometimes verge on pious hand-wringing. It would be naive to ignore the impact. A more significant and enduring role for the ex-chiefs is the opportunity to mentor younger officers. Similar examples of patronage occur in all large organizations, but it is not unknown for future chiefs to be identified and their subsequent careers carefully managed more than a decade ahead, while still leaving sufficient candidates to cope with attrition through accident or misadventure. The potential for scandal, accident, or sudden illness is never far from the mind of the Air Secretary in building a succession plan for the RAF's senior leadership. Experience has demonstrated that air marshals are no more immune to the human condition than flight lieutenants. None of this makes the RAF dysfunctional, quite the opposite. Without individuality, there are no tensions, no argument, and, to be honest, no progress. Rarely does a new commander fail to initiate a change in direction, occasionally backward, but always different. Working toward a shared purpose does not require individuals to abandon their personal interests, ambitions, and prejudices. These differences are largely lost in organizational noise, but not at the highest ranks. It might be thought that enmity between senior officers, both personal and professional, is of the past, a product of the extraordinary circumstances facing the RAF in its earliest years. This is an overly optimistic view. Indeed, there is no reason why we should expect harmony between senior officers, but antagonism between individual air marshals has an immediate and damaging impact on their staffs, who are drawn into a proxy war. This is as true today as it was 100 years ago, although before we rush to condemn those who successfully led the RAF in 2 world wars, we should consider whether any organization, comprising large numbers of sentient human beings, can separate emotion, prejudice, and personal belief from day-to-day business. Without individuality, there is no imagination, no innovation, and no way to confront new threats and new opportunities. A dynamic and diverse senior leadership team is the foundation of military success and, in war, the price of victory. As ever, however, it is a matter of finding the right balance. When Sir Hugh Trenchard retired in 1929, after 10 years as CAS, he was presented with a farewell gift from his senior Air Force colleagues. Trenchard's note of thanks, although characteristically restrained, expressed his gratitude to the Bow and Arrow Brigade. Those officers who had served with him at Headquarters RFC, HQ RFC, the Army's aviation headquarters on the Western Front, responsible for directing air operations in support of the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, during World War I. The role of this small group of individuals has never been explored in detail, yet they were critical not only in developing an effective air weapon, but also in creating the preconditions for the formation of the RAF, an event traditionally ascribed to a combination of political expediency, strategic opportunity, economic necessity, and logistic efficiency. These factors were undoubtedly important, but they do not adequately explain why such a momentous decision was taken during the largest and most testing war undertaken by Great Britain, up to that date, and why such a radical and unprecedented idea was so strongly supported. The extensive historiography on the establishment of the RAF says little about these aspects, or the pivotal role played by HQ RFC, yet it was the professionalism and reputation of the headquarters staffs that provided the foundation for the decision to create a separate air arm. As Jeremy Black has observed, great events need not have great causes. The RAF came into being as much through administrative efficiency and management competence as operational brilliance. The development of air power during World War I was a complex, instinctive, and sometimes erratic process. The focus of the fighting was the Western Front, where the strongest adversaries, France, Germany, and Great Britain, confronted each other in a positional battle that lasted for just over 4 years. Military aviation made huge strides during this time, as aviators, engineers, and designers experimented with new techniques and rapidly improving technologies. Innovation and imitation went hand in hand as the respective air commanders strove to gain a decisive advantage. There were no boundaries to what aviation might achieve on the battlefield, other than imagination, and there was no shortage of imagination. Tactical advance was met by tactical response. Innovative technology generated more innovation. New roles generated counter-roles. It is hardly surprising that the evidence for how military doctrine evolved to incorporate aviation is diverse and sometimes contradictory. In attempting to make sense of this maelstrom of ideas, innovation, and progress, there is the danger of imposing a pattern, an air power learning curve, if you will, that makes more sense than is truthful. This is particularly the case when we consider the influence of World War I on the employment of air power in World War II. The shadow of the combined bomber offensive lies uneasily over the Western Front and its historians. At the start of World War I, there was no indication that air power would become a decisive factor on the battlefield. The possibility of air combat, of bombing the enemy's homeland and sinking warships from the air, had all been discussed, but developing these capabilities and establishing their utility fell far behind the rhetoric. Little was certain about the types of aircraft that would be needed, how they would be organised, and how they were to be employed. There was, for example, no agreement on the respective advantages of airplanes and airships. There was no clarity on whether flying squadrons should comprise a single type or multiple types. We take it for granted that modern warfare is three-dimensional, but this was not the view prior to 1914. Over the next 4 years, the air arms of all the major powers expanded hugely. By the armistice, the British, French, and Germans could each deploy thousands of machines across the battlefront in a wide range of roles, including strategic bombing. The utility of airplanes emerged slowly but rapidly gained momentum as the importance of artillery cooperation and aerial photography was recognised. This was a period of rapid change and violent debate about the potential of air power and how it should be employed. As aviation capabilities improved, tactics evolved and new strategies emerged. This was not a linear process and was marked by failure as much as by success and by excessive optimism as much as by blind resistance. This study will show how personality and character influenced the direction and speed of air power development, and how differing organisational decisions, in essence who controlled what and who reported to whom, were responsible for the divergent strategies adopted by the British, French and Germans. The importance of individuals is underscored by the status of the respective leadership teams. Senior aviators in the British Air Services were invariably younger and enjoyed a higher rank than their French and German counterparts, even though British military aviation was the smallest of the three when war broke out. Central to any discussion of the British Air Services during World War I is Hugh Trenchard, the dominant figure in British military aviation for 15 years, and, behind the scenes, for over 30. Leadership in wartime is a difficult balancing act. Commanders need to offer certainty while managing the uncertainty that war brings. Neither side plans to lose, neither side expects to lose. Confidence that the enemy can be beaten, confidence in one's colleagues, and confidence in one's weapons and tactics provide the bedrock for all military organisations, yet these very certainties are most at risk when the fighting begins. A Major General before he was 42, Trenchard had to face these realities while coping with the extraordinary and evolving nature of air warfare, in which small groups of men flew in machines, operating from bases far to the rear, and fought each other above and often well beyond the front line. A war that was so different that journalists and politicians resorted to the language of medieval warfare, describing pilots as knights of the sky and lauding their chivalric combat. The contrast with the stalemate in the trenches could not have been starker. Trenchard met these challenges through single-mindedness and force of character, even though his personality was deeply flawed and even though he lacked many of the skills required for high command. These weaknesses should have resulted in failure, but Trenchard succeeded because he recognised his deficiencies and found colleagues and friends who could substitute for what he lacked. Or to be more precise, he found colleagues and one exceptional friend, Maurice Baring. This study explores how two individuals with divergent personalities, contrasting qualities and very different social backgrounds built a friendship that helped transform the British air effort on the Western Front. It was as unlikely and as fragile as any relationship forged in wartime, yet it lasted for more than 30 years. Chapter 1. An Unlikely Soldier, an Unlikely Partnership. Maurice Baring was one of the more unlikely soldiers to join the British Expeditionary Force, BEF, sent to France following the German invasion of Belgium and Britain's declaration of war against Germany on the 4th of August 1914. Conscription, introduced in January 1916, saw significant numbers of men enter the army who were neither physically nor temperamentally suited to military life. However, at the start of the conflict, the War Office could pick and choose whom they accepted. Against all the odds, the 40-year-old Baring, journalist, author, poet and playwright, without military experience or martial skills, arrived by steamer at Boulogne on the evening of Tuesday, the 11th of August 1914, as an intelligence officer attached to HQ RFC, 3 days before the BEF's Commander-in-Chief, Sir John French, set foot in France. Bering's friend and colleague, the writer Hilaire Belloc, who had completed French military service, also volunteered for the BEF, but was summarily rejected by the War Office. Admittedly, Bering was 4 years younger, but how did he find himself in uniform when even younger soldiers, both part-time and professional, were denied the same opportunity? It was a question that perplexed his friends, Conrad Russell and Oberon Bron Herbert, both of whom were in the yeomanry. Incidentally, the word uniform should be employed with caution, in view of Bering's chronic inability to dress the part. Nan Herbert, Bron's sister, recorded how Bering was quite unable to tie up his puttees without the assistance of others. Following Bering's death on the 14th of December 1945, MRAF Sir Hugh Trenchard, known throughout the RFC as Boom because of his deep, gruff voice and brusque manner, wrote to the Times, adding his personal recollections to the obituary published the previous day. Major Maurice Bering was on the staff of Headquarters RFC. He had met me when I first landed in France. I had always intended not to keep him, as I did not know him, but the very first day he showed me his complete lack of self-interest, his complete honesty, and his wonderful loyalty to Sir David Henderson and others. He was a genius at knowing the young pilots and airmen. He knew more about what mattered in war and how to deal with human nature, how to stir up those who wanted stirring up, how to damp down those who were too excitable, how to encourage those who were new to it, and in telling me when I was unfair more than any other man I know. He was a man I could always trust. He was my mentor and guide, and, if I may say so, almost my second sight in all the difficult tasks that came in future years. In the words of a great Frenchman, there never was a staff officer in any country, in any nation, in any century like Major Maurice Bering. He was the most unselfish man I have ever met or am likely to meet. The Flying Corps owed this man much more than they know or think. His RFC HQ should be read and reread, even partially to understand this great man. He never once failed me, though I must have tried him highly. All the juniors had confidence in him, and all the seniors loved him. It was he who brought the tone of service into the RFC, and brought into it altogether a feeling of doing service to help other men and save lives in the army, on the land, and in the navy at sea. I can pay no higher tribute. Words fail me in describing this man. There are two aspects of Trenchard's eulogy that merit explanation: the identity of the great Frenchman and the significance of RFC HQ. The great Frenchman is generally assumed to have been Marshal Ferdinand Foch, the Allied Supreme Commander in 1918. Foch's name was first suggested by Laura Lovett in her memoir describing Bering's final years as her house guest in Scotland, incapacitated by Parkinson's disease. The great Frenchman was not Foch, but General Edouard de Castelnau, an officer of considerable ability and charm who commanded the French Second Army on the outbreak of war when Foch was one of his subordinates. De Castelnau's reputation suffered when his 1914 offensive into Lorraine failed, but he played a critical role in the Battle of the Marne, holding Nancy in the face of heavy German attacks. He was also instrumental in saving Verdun, but lost his post after Nivelle replaced Joffre as Commander-in-Chief of the French armies. When Nivelle was sacked and replaced by Pétain, with Foch as Chief of the General Staff, de Castelnau was appointed to command the French Eastern Army Group. Notwithstanding his evident abilities and sympathetic personality, de Castelnau was a polarizing figure who excited as much criticism as praise. It was de Castelnau who made it possible for the RAF Independent Force, RAF-IF, to mount a bombing campaign against Germany during the summer and autumn of 1918. Trenchard, as commander of the RAF-IF, paid tribute to the very valuable assistance which he, de Castelnau, and his staff gave me, and for advice which helped me over the many difficulties inseparable from an organisation of such a kind. Trenchard, with Bering as his interpreter, had numerous meetings with de Castelnau during the summer and autumn of 1918. Bering provides an emotionally charged picture of de Castelnau. To hear him talk was like reading, was to breathe the atmosphere in which classic French was born, racy, natural, idiomatic, and utterly free from anything shoddy, artificial or pretentious. The two men unquestionably got on well together. They had much in common. Both came from aristocratic families, and both were staunch Catholics.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?